Okay, I'm going to get started here in a second. There's a bit of delay that takes a bit to get used to, but all right. Okay, so this is the first live that I've had, and I welcome you to What Do You Want in Your Relationship? Are you finding what you're seeking? So I'll explain that title in a minute, or hopefully we'll figure that out. But my desire is that as beings, we're always seeking. I'm going to be focusing on our emotional relational wants today. It's really the tip of the iceberg, and we'll briefly touch on other aspects of relating. So I plan to do some other videos about that. On the physiological side, our body side, right? When we're hungry or thirsty, we go to, eventually we want to go and eat or to go drink something to quench those desires. So we go to seek those when we need it. When we need information, it's not physiological, but information, we might go to a search engine like Google or something like that. When we need sleep, that's another body kind of need that we have. We go to bed. We don't always think about these experiences, but it's happening all the time. Of course, my focus will be on the relationship side, relationship to ourselves and to our partners, or if we want to have a partner. So my purpose is to help those watching to look at what we, as we all do, what we're seeking. What is it that you want in your relationship? What's your intention? What's your purpose? What's the drive there? And there's probably bunches of those, and we'll get into some of those today. It's not always what we think. Sometimes we're good, and I'll get into that also. We can get stuck on looking outside of ourselves, wanting from another person and seeking from them, and then that creates some of that difficulty. Wanting them to do something, to act in a certain way, or not behave in a certain way. And these are often ways to try to get what we're seeking. In many relationships, though, it turns into a tug of war, a battle. And when people are tired of battling, they just start to withdraw. So in this kind of brief workshop, I suggest that we've missed some steps along the way. We just didn't even know. There's some things we can do to make it more likely for us to get our needs met and our partner's needs met. So I'm going to invite you to join me today, stay for a little bit, to learn about the steps of the process. Before I do that, though, and I forget to do this a lot, but I'm going to try to make it a little more formal part of our time together, but just a mindful awareness exercise. So first thing, in order to be focused and centered, and if those words are new to you, I'll probably talk about them along the way, but just to be able to be here at this moment, to hear this information, I invite you to take a few slower breaths. Now, as I'm doing this, it's going to be helpful for me, but I'll kind of pause. So just so you can be present, understand these ideas in a relational way, not just an informational way. So it's kind of like a more right brain versus left brain analytic piece, but our left brain will still probably be around. So we can connect to that special person or someone's. So if you can, not everybody can do this. So if you're in a place where you can't do it, you're driving, using equipment, cooking, and so on, you may not be able to do it right now. If you can stop whatever you're doing, pull off to a side of the road, or just be able to, put the food, turn off the burners or whatever, so they're, just taking a pause, so you're safe. If you're doing these things, can you just take a moment to take in a breath? And it doesn't have to be a deep breath. Just a little slower than what you may be doing regularly. And so then just, let it in and let it out. That's like a count of 2. Some people can go much longer than that. I can sometimes. I'm a little focused on what I want to present, so I'm trying to be in both sides of my brain here. But try to gentle your breath for just a few moments. Just take a few in. If you've meditated a lot, you may be able to go much slower and deeper than this. But just take a pause, like 30 seconds to a minute. And this can be done, for yourself at other times too. For the rest of us, just go a little slower than you were breathing before. Just do this a couple of times. It can kind of bring us into the moment. Some people understand that awareness, some people may not. But just slowly breathing can get us focused and away from having, to do something. And you are doing something right now. If you can't do this, some people, it may be hard to do this. So we don't spend a lot of time on it, but that's okay. There's another way to do this, is just to focus on a small part of ourselves and not worry about the breathing. Just kind of focus on a part of our being. So on a cell of our body, sometimes I imagine it in my hand. I could imagine like my small finger. I could imagine my big toe, and just imagine those parts because I'm relating to that part of my body. Just think about those, kind of sense those. How are they? Mine are a little chilly. It's a little cool for May. I'm recording this in May in Colorado, so it's a little different. It's gotten chilly. It was warm into the 80s, 70s and 80s, and now it's been in the like 50s. We've gotten a lot of rain, and it's a little cooler, so my hands are a little cooler. So just imagine yourself looking out for that part of you, just noticing, what does that part need right now from me? And just be kind to it. You don't have to do anything, just set the intention toward that part of you. What is it wanting? What does it do for me? What does it do for others? My pinky, helps me when I'm writing. There's various times when I'm grasping something, but it's not the main finger. It's just one of my fingers. So I guess if you do pinky swears, then comes in handy there too. Can you think of that part of you for being there? Thank it. Thank it. Not just think about it, but thank it. Just think. We're very complex. Our bodies are complex. All the chemical reactions going on, all the physiological processes. So there's a lot going on. Just focusing on a little bit can keep that, comfortable. If you haven't noticed, my dog has joined us. He's Chicago, and he's been moving about. So maybe when I slow down, sometimes he does that. So as we think about what you're seeking and what you want in a relationship, where do we start? So I'm going to just start at this place with what you want. What do you want in your relationship? You go, well, you might have a bunch of ideas, and I'll get into those in a minute. But other words that sometimes fit for us are, it can be desires. Sometimes we use that word. Sometimes that's not quite the sense that we have about the thing that we want to have, what we want to experience. Longings is another one. It depends on the context, right? Sometimes desires, to go back to that, could be like, desirous means something sexual. So sometimes that may not fit other parts of us, but a lot of people use the word need. I will use that. I try not to use it too much, because often thinking, what do I need in a relationship, is I start to judge myself as being needy. Sometimes maybe our partner does, because it's more than what they can provide, for example. but it becomes kind of there's a negative or a painful kind of connotation to it. So what are our values? How do I want this relationship to be? So there's some big, that can be kind of the big perspective of how do I want us to be together? How do I want to be in the relationship? How do I want to connect to another person? We are seeking beings. It's a very basic part, very deep in our brain, in the primary emotional aspect. And there's some research that I've been learning about that just been describing that. And there's a deep part of us that drives a lot more. We have our thinking brain, but way below that, there's a seeking part that just knows, and they're influenced, of course, our thinking part of our brain with that, some very deep structures. But that is very much a part of a being, and we're human beings, but our daily life, what were we seeking? Are we seeking to learn and so on? You're here today, so maybe you're seeking a different relationship or things to understand or to learn. It's how we're made. And this is sometimes hard to accept, but it's going on all the time. So we're often looking for experiences, and I'll get more into this idea of wants, needs in another. I'll get more specific, but for today's purposes, I want to hit on a bunch as far as just relationships and the experiences, because it's fairly complex, can be very complex, and I'll try to simplify it as much as possible. But we want some complexity because we're complex beings. So how does it fit? Not everything's so simple, but I'll try to simplify as much as possible. So you might be looking for an experience of connecting to your partner. So often when couples reach out to me, or a person reaches out to me about a relationship, they will use terms like, I want to be able to communicate better, to be, and so that is kind of a way, excuse me, a way to have a want met. I want to be able to communicate is kind of a need, but it also can be part of, I want to be seen. So I speak up. Communication happens more than just with words. It's the how we say it, what our face looks like, our body language. So that communication, we might want to just be seen. We could be communicating like, that's communication. And I may not even be going, hi. We want to be known. We might want to be known that the other person knows us and understands us, right? And then we have that understanding piece in a practical day-to-day kind of way too. We might want to be heard. Some of us are very verbal. And so we might really want to be heard. Like, does the other person really hear me? Not just say, oh, can repeat the words back, but what do I mean by what I say? So it plays into kind of a need around meaning. Acknowledgement. Does the person acknowledge me? Sometimes we might be talking to a person in the other room. Sometimes that's just practical. Or, like if we have kids and little ones and one parent is bathing the kiddo and the other one is working with another child in a different room, getting them ready for the bathtub or getting them, reading them a book at bedtime, that kind of thing. So the communication may be from another room, but it can break down a lot especially if it's happening a lot. So there's that aspect. And then there's also, we want love. I want love in my relationship. And kind of what does that mean? It can mean lots of different things, and it depends on the day, the time, the person. But, in general, affection. So we have affection, right? Some of us want affection, and how we like affection. What does that mean to us? Some of us may like more, intense public displays of affections, and other people like to be private. So it's both of those things can be related to affection, but it's so nuanced by the person. We all have needs, But, how that fits for each of us is kind of not necessarily a mystery. It can become that, it can feel like that, but that's why I'm talking. That's why I'm doing the workshop. So also warmth, we may want warmth. Someone who's loving is warm, isn't talking to me in kind of a distant, cold way all the time. Sometimes we have to around information, logistical things, but sometimes we can do, we want warmth from that person. Companionship might be another thing. Love means that you're with me. Intimacy. Some people want intimacy that means they're in their space. It could be emotional intimacy. It could be physical intimacy. So those desires. In the contrast, in relationships, this will come up too. We also have a drive, or that's kind of another word for the needs or the wants or those longings, is some autonomy. Some of us need more autonomy, more freedom, more space, more ability to choose certain things and not feel like we have to. And others need less of that. So that can be very, I'll probably have a class just on that, but I have some plans to talk about choice. How do we choose? What do we choose? And it will be a piece of this because choice comes up. How much choice do I want? And hopefully you have lots of choice all the time without feeling overwhelmed by the decisions. And what I'm talking about there is the have tos. Do I have to act like this for my partner, or do I choose to? And I'll talk more about that. Because if we have to do things all day, all the time for our partner, that that can be very wearing too. So how much freedom do I need to have? And sometimes it could be that we're trying to get away from the partner for that, but some of it could be that we could have more even together. But it's kind of a balancing act, and these things are very dynamic and they're changing from day to day, week to week, year to year, depending on our lives, our careers, our work, our how we contribute, families, and so on. But how much connection, how much time apart, or what does that mean? What does that look like? So when we get what we want, we might feel, oh yeah, I need to kind of give you a little jump in. I have my notes that I'm kind of referring to, but when we get what we want, gosh, that's when we have those feelings of happiness and joy typically. Like I got what I want and I feel happy, or I feel satisfied, or I feel fulfilled, loved, appreciated, invigorated. That can be so wonderful. And of course, that's a lot of what we probably want, you may want in your relationship, is that experience. Those are feelings, by the way. And I get into more of this kind of dynamic, some of the key components, this being one of them. But when we get those things that we want or need or desire, there's usually pleasurable feelings. So if you can think back to a time when you had those things, maybe at the beginning of the relationship or periodically or recently, you go, oh, I wanted this from my husband, my wife, my significant other, the partner, whatever, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever that might look like for you. Just imagine and kind of sense that in your body. Why do I do that? Because we also tends to be some bodily experience. So yeah, I'm going to try to slow down right there. Just imagine some of those times when there was so much joy. Maybe at the beginning of that relationship. Often there's this kind of feeling of bliss and oceanic kind of connection that we can have kind of early when you're starting to fall in love, people might say. And you feel connected. There may be intimacy in a variety of ways. There can be some bliss. Our brains are just firing up there. But hopefully it happens periodically too. Surprises, planning a date for the partner and then taking them out on that date and having the desire to connect during that time. at places you both might want. So it could be like that too. So hopefully we're able to do that. Just invite you to do that, because that can really help to bolster it. When there are problems in relationships, that can kind of go away. We'll forget that, and because there's conflict in that, but that's for another workshop. We'll go into that a little bit. So let me move forward toward the direction where we're not getting what we're seeking. And I'm going to choose kind of a topic, and hopefully this makes sense to you. Framework of the 5 love languages, which is a really well, it's well written, it's clear, it's in easy to understand language. A very popular book. If you haven't read it, that's okay. But a lot of people have. And so it just talks about 5 key love languages, right? It's easy to read. Often we can understand kind of the basic ideas. Sometimes those ideas are very challenging in getting it, it implemented. One of the problems I think that I've read about is that people will use it against the other person. Well, I have a love language like that. So to me, what that's saying is what is it that I'm wanting? We come back to the theme for today. What are we wanting? What are we needing? What are we desiring? And that isn't giving it to us. So that's kind of like love actions. The love being a verb in this case. So it's the action, how to get some needs met. And there's some preferred ways of getting those met. So, things like how we're spoken to. So it talks about like words of affirmation, and it can meet the needs related to communication, being known, heard, acknowledged, right? Those could be the reasons. And that's why I'm mentioning it. What does that give me if I hear those words, that communication? What do I end up with? It's kind of the vehicle, and I'll go more into that in a little bit, but I just kind of want to lay this groundwork, maybe with a framework that you've come from and know a little bit about. And it's relatively simple in its structure. Not always easy to implement, and that's kind of what I'm trying to illustrate. Giving gifts can be another one. And that could be like you're considering the other person, and so it meets those wants of feeling considered. You know what I might like, or you were thinking of me, and then giving the gift is an action that can get us that. Quality time is another one of those love languages, and it can meet the need for companionship, just being together, maybe. And these words are really, they're kind of a general framework, and you may use different words, but probably similar, but somewhat different. Affection, so can help meet those needs for love and caring. Sexual closeness, sometimes there'll be a partner who says, gosh, I just, I'm not able to have physical intimacy, and it's bothersome. Depending on the background, I actually think some of the things will be talking about will help us to get more of that. That's really what the idea was, and hopefully I think I've mentioned that a couple of times, is that we meet our needs. It's about meeting what we want, getting more of that, not in a selfish kind of way, but how can we do that? How can we give that to our partner? Acts of service is another one. So some of us like to contribute or be mutually supportive, like you do this and I'll do that. And so they like the service end of things, and that meets some wants or support, or the feeling that you're being supportive. These are ways to seek and find what we're wanting to experience. So love languages, because their actions are, kind of general ways of doing things, they can help in that method. I find them as okay because they give us some ideas, and I'm not saying it doesn't work. I think it's probably worked for lots of folks, but some of us, they can also turn into those points of contention, because we can't always be thinking that way. And really what I think might be helpful is going deeper into, and I'll show that in another time, I call it a dynamic structure. It's kind of the framework, kind of a framework, but it's not a formula on how you could do more of that. So we can get those needs met. Those are avenues, and avenues, there's so many variety of avenues to get, to where we're wanting to go. It's kind of the how. And really some of that seeking is there's implied how, because of what we're wanting to get. And you can see where some of the conflict will be is, if we're feeling like we're told we have to do things in this direction, that might interfere with some of the freedom and autonomy needs we have. Some of us are okay with telling people what to do and having them do it. But most of us, many of us, well, we're going to struggle if we're always telling someone that we want this thing. It's not going to be very, fulfilling to us. We want them to want to do it, right? And then they can do other things in that direction. And it's not by tricking them. So I can go on. I mean, there's lots of directions we can go from there. But when we're getting our needs met, we tend to feel, those or when we're seeking, we can be inspired and kind of switching gears to the seeking part. So, and that's what I invite you to do is seek. If it's using some of like the 5 love languages or a particular one or 2 or 3, wonderful. And I think that's why that book is probably so popular, partly is because we're inspired. We want to learn. We're excited, enthusiastic, maybe fascinated and kind of in my field because of what I'm interested. Why are we like this? We could be enchanted, like really in that direction of trying to learn as we anticipate fulfilling those needs and desires for ourselves and for our partner, because it can feel very warm. It can be very fulfilling if I feel like I've met another person's need, that I've contributed to them. So we may love our partner and we want to meet their needs, their wants. We usually want them to do that for us too. I mean, usually that is very helpful. Doesn't have to be exact, but reciprocity, where it's you're doing this and I'm doing that. If it gets too far into like, oh, it's got to be even, or, it's a contract. Most people I've worked with don't really want to have a contract to do all of this. And that can be a way to do it. And I know that some approaches would encourage that. I just go, relationships are much more personal than that. So I think I've kind of gone into the hit and miss of some of those approaches. If I guess how you want me to meet this need, and so really what I'm encouraging is to get to those points. That's not always easy, and a lot of times we don't even know what those are, but we can explore them, not all at once, but over time. So there are ways and methods and strategies and solutions, and they're all over the place. There's basic, information out there how to move in that direction, but that doesn't always work. And we'll have workshops. I plan on some workshops or these meetings to kind of talk about like what that really looks like. What gets in the way? Because there's we're complex. So we have histories, we have ways of connecting, things that have influenced us on our past and things that are influencing us now. So we want to be able to clearly communicate and connect. Usually when I start to get involved in someone's life, and not always does it get to this point, but often there's a lot of dissatisfaction. So we're observing inside this thing isn't getting met over and over again. And some things do, but some big important ones or frequent things that we need more frequently aren't happening. And that can lead to feelings of anxiety. Like and some of us will have more anxiety than others, especially if we've grown up in places where, in homes, for example, where things weren't as sure. So that gets really complex, but we might feel anxious, like, oh, is that thing going to happen? Am I going to be able to get that? Uh, another another feeling might be that feeling of aloneness. Some of us might start to panic at that moment because even though we're together, some of us aren't really together. We're not really there. We're more like roommates, for example. Some of us are going to get frustrated when we're trying to get a need met and we can't. We might be frustrated. So we'll get frustrated. And all of these feelings have kind of urges to do something, actions behind them. So that's where, this information can be helpful, because some of those actions can get those needs met, but some of them may not always be as helpful. Frustration is one of those. It's very important, it can be very valid, but the actions related to it can be very problematic. So confusion, a lot of times we're feeling confused, like, what do I have to do to get that need met? Some of us, when it's getting down the road, we could get dismayed, despondent, exhausted feelings like, oh, I feel like I'm giving to you and I don't feel like I get as much back. Not that it has to be even, hopefully, but it just doesn't feel as reciprocal. So something that's helpful is that we're looking and trying with our significant other, or that, another person that we're dating, if we're dating, right? So we're out looking. And sometimes we get tired of looking. We just get tired of seeking to meet some things. We feel like, oh, that's not going to work. And there are times to take breaks on certain needs. They'll pop back up if they need to. And I find that that's true for most of us. Not everyone, but many of us. So I tend to work with individuals and couples when it's not working. So when our seeking, we're not getting a lot of our needs met in a way that is, helpful. So people are thinking of splitting, separating, divorcing, things like that. They often say, and I think I mentioned it at the beginning, they might feel like there is we're not communicating. Some people might use the terms like, I feel like roommates. There's different kinds of connections that we might have with a roommate. What's our agreement? What do we desire? What do we expect from a roommate? And those can be more or less depending on ourselves and the other person. That last one, feeling like roommates, or that one can help us, contrast, the expectations could be very different in a roommate, like just very logistical, like picking up the kids. Let me explain that a little. That idea, let me clarify. That came out a little clunky, but from my vantage point, not quite how I wanted to express it. So sometimes when we're feeling like roommates, there's a lot of needs probably for connection, deeper connection, physical connection may not be there. And it can happen in serious romantic relationships. There might be too much space, not enough warmth. Sometimes because we've been arguing, we get into these circular arguments that can just go on and on, sometimes for a long time. Some of us avoid those, so we can't even communicate with each other. So it's just when we're with a partner, if we're with our husband, wife, we usually boyfriend, girlfriend, significant other, partner, we want different things from them and to give them than we usually do with a roommate. Roommates are usually, not always, those are things to discuss too, because their relationship. But some roommates might want to spend time together. Other roommates don't really care about that. Some are just kind of come and go. That's their room. So it just kind of depends. And hopefully there's some discussion about that. In this fast-paced world, it's often very difficult. And that can happen if you have a lot of things going on, very busy at your career, have children, stepchildren, blended families. I mean, you add these pieces in and it can make it more challenging. But if we can start to figure out, what is it that I want to happen? How do I want to be? What do I want from the partner? It will help to settle that a little bit. And I really encourage, and I encourage people I work with, like, don't jump to how to do that yet. Let's figure out how come. Now, what is that thing first? That's why I started. This is my first live workshop on that, or workshop in that direction. There are desires that, we all like to get them met, but it gets really tricky. So we're evaluating a lot. So we'll evaluate, does that thing meet my need? And when it does, that's when we have those pleasant, pleasurable, joyous kind of feelings. And when they doesn't, it's when we have those other feelings. And sometimes some of us don't even notice the feelings, and some feelings are not okay. So it gets really complex. And that's where some of these problems, can start to rise fairly early in relationships. So we might try a strategy to kind of, get in this direction. I need you to do this. I want you to do that. And sometimes, it depends on how it comes out, how it's presented, how we understand. So that's why I go, let's back up a little bit and go, what is it that I'm really wanting? Because I might be working with you and you might be like, oh, I don't, what do you want to focus on? Where do we need to go? What is it where are we headed? Because how we get there, there's a lot of different ways to get there depending on what's going on. So, so some of us, how do we get that? So you might be wondering at this point, hopefully I've kind of brought that up. How do we do that? To what we want? How do we move in that direction? Some of us might hint at it. We don't feel or imply or allude to it. How do we get that thing? And because, and this gets a little tricky, for some of us, especially, how guys are supposed to act maybe in a particular culture or subculture, and how women are supposed to act, or how we think we should act. And those can be very different. And so some of us can be very strong and direct, and others are being more subtle. Or if we feel like we're going to be asking too much, we might be more subtle. And all of those things are okay. But it's not always clear what we want. So we don't always want to be pushy. So, but some of us can approach things in more of a hinting kind of way. I mean, that works. And some things, if they're not real important, that's certainly okay. Or if it's a method that's like, it's just, like not much time to think it through or discuss it, that's okay. When that's the norm, that's a little different. Some of us can cajole other people to do things. Cajoling can be helpful, kind of in a fun, gentle way, but we don't always want to be coaxing someone into, these actions. We want them to want it. And I find that, that happens when I work with couples and individuals. They want to feel like the other person knows them and wants to participate. Some of us don't know what's going on. That's why I'm speaking about this, this topic. What is it we're seeking? It's very broad, but it's also very specific at times. Some of us can approach this by suggesting to our partners. Some of us might ask, could you do this? I'd like you to. How about you do this? Sometimes this works, by the way. Sometimes it depends on the amount and frequency. There's lots of factors that play into how does that work, because there's needs. People are trying to meet their needs in various ways that may or may not be available. Sometimes people say, yes, I'll do it, but they really don't want to. So, but there's nothing wrong with asking that in itself, because sometimes we just need to. That's where we kind of get into the more direct, I just want this thing, so I just ask for it. But if we ask with a limited amount of information, that can be part of the struggle, right? If I don't know my spouse, and I just go, what's wrong? And I have no hint or idea about what might be going on in her life, or his life, it's going to be really hard to connect. That question can get old. Like, don't you know? I've told you before. This comes up. There's some male-female differences there. Talk about those eventually. I don't want to get too far down there. And it can vary. Sometimes it could be the guy or the woman who feel like that. So yeah, culturally, though, guys can be very direct, but it's not always clear, or it's so direct it can be overwhelming, or it could be so frequent, or it could feel like things haven't been reciprocal. So I think I'll spend one meeting where we kind of talk about, like, how do we create that moment? And we can't always do that, but over important things, we may want to not just ask right then. So sometimes this isn't going to work. Some of these efforts aren't going to work because I'm kind of moving into a little taste of that piece is our request is not the priority right then for the other person. Is it a time when they can do that thing, even hear us right at that moment? Sometimes even when we're asking, it can sound like a criticism. Sometimes it can sound like a demand. You have to. Depends on the tone of voice. It depends on the directness. The directness can make it a little harsher sounding. It can come out roughly. Sometimes we're anxious, and I have made plenty of these mistakes. It comes out roughly instead of gently. It may be another request after a long line of requests, so it doesn't feel like it's equal. And I know that sometimes for people who have children, there's a lot of things that I need help with the kids. Could you help with this? Could you help with that? And the other partner is like, oh, that's all it's about. Kids just take up a lot of time and energy. It's not always easy to have a close relationship with children. It's not their fault. It's just their beings, and they're very important, and they take priority a lot of the time. But then that's where those questions can come in. And if one of the partners is the primary caregiver or supervise, the management, household manager, the other person can feel like inundated, but that person might be doing so many things. They need that help. And of course, asking, sometimes that's just, we need that. Can't talk about it for a long period of time, but eventually maybe spending time alone talking about what's the structure. I've noticed that sometimes the partner who doesn't do a lot of the care, if one of those parties is, they have no idea how the day goes or what's supposed to happen. And that can feel like to the other party, like, are you even here? Like, why do I need to ask you? I've heard that come up while I'm working with couples. Well, what do you want me to do? Well, it's because sometimes it seems obvious to one partner and not the other. What are they needing? Like, there's food just sitting on the counter waiting to be cooked or chopped or like whatever, because someone's helping with homework, for example, or has this call from work, whatever may happen. And so they're needing something and they're kind of wanting the other person. That's where frustration can come up, because did the other person not see it? They just kept going. Or the trash, that would be a common one. Sometimes it's one person's responsibility, whether that's voluntarily or just assumed. I mean, sometimes that's something to talk about, but it's piling up and the person just keeps walking by it. And then the person gets mad, like they can't put any more food. You can probably guess what gender, that might be, but it can vary, right? Like, that's just a place of conflict, and how we handle conflict is so important. And if we know what we're wanting, what the other person wants, if we understand each other, then we can move in that direction. Does the other person have the capacity at that moment to hear it and understand what we're saying? So I will give women kudos. It's not, not every woman has to feel this way. Sometimes they might feel like that's a cultural expectation. Sometimes I think it comes across that way. Women are in charge of relationships and social aspects of a couple, for a couple or a family. And not always, but in a lot of homes. So but sometimes women, and some of this can be biological. Hopefully I'll hit on that at some point. There's some research about that that certain temperaments, and a lot of women have some of those temperaments, or that they have more of it than some of the other, or than guys. They'll be thinking about that other partner so much. And I'll do this sometimes, and I go, what were you thinking, during a session? You see this, and then what did you think about what was going on inside your husband or your boyfriend or something? Like they came in and they looked confused, or they looked frustrated, or and they're picking up signals, and they may just go, what's wrong? But they may be thinking, oh my goodness, what is he hungry? Has it been a while? He was doing this project. I wonder how the project, did he hurt himself? Did something get in the way? Is there something else that he, is considering? Or is he just really focused? Because sometimes when we get that look, it can look angry, but it's actually the affect or the facial kind of expression that is actually just being focused. So, but I find that sometimes the woman is just thinking of all these possibilities and wants to know. Now, once we're down the road a ways, that doesn't always become apparent. And then that's where I go, sometimes that person might be really exhausted, especially if they've been dealing with maybe a work, conflict, or a work project that was just really urgent and intense. Or if that person was taking care of the children, or has health issues. So, or they have changes. Biologically, women and men are mostly similar, but in some ways a little different. So their biology changes. Some of their biological aspects change from week to week. They're not always wanting the same things, or their body might be in pain one week and not the next. And it's guys' hormones, for example, don't change that much. And that's just important. And maybe one week you could be, that woman might be more available for something, and another week not. And thank goodness, I really appreciate that women carry babies and deliver them. I was just like talking about that recently, and that's just like such a huge thing. And they're so connected often, not all women, and that's not an expectation, but I just noticed those trends, and there are, some science behind that. So sometimes we're just really tired. We just can't do anymore. Maybe the other person wants us to, but we don't want to. Sometimes men, in the way their kind of biology works, is they need some space. They do, like they do checklists for some guys. And then when they have another thing and another thing and another thing, they don't really feel, like they have time to rest, which is a need. And sometimes it's hard when you have like lots of activity going on, but how can they get that need met? Because the other partner might go, well, you're just sitting there, because they're kind of recouping or kind of thinking through things. Because women can move often, and we'll make it too male female, but there are these differences. And I've noticed some of their capacity is different. Some of their focus could be very different. Like they're just moving from this thing to that thing to that thing, and they've got all these things in their mind. And guys can be much more linear, like one thing at a time. So, so how we approach them, and I'm not saying you shouldn't bring things up with the husband, or with the wife, but there are times, and we trying to make, depending on the importance of whatever we're trying to discuss, when would that be the better time? So often strategies or solutions just, they're not going to work because we don't really understand. And that framework I talk about will focus on that. So it's amazing how busy, we are, and how can we always be available. It's a place to start to understand each other. Who are you? Who am I? What do I want? How am I feeling? Those things are very key, but sometimes we just skip that. We got to do this. We got to do that. but incorporating some of that slowly. You can't just change all of that immediately. Usually our brains just don't work like that. And I plan to spend another class just talking about that structure of how to see, and it's how I actually approach a lot of interactions, especially with clients. Like, I'm listening for these aspects, and then they can help kind of gear once I understand, hopefully I understand where someone's coming from, and then I can move in that direction. I know I'm not telling you all that, it just will make it a little more complex. We're just focused on those needs, and we'll talk more about how to approach people and what people are wanting, so they have space to move and change these conversations. We're so complex, right? Now, we'll have an evaluating brain, and that is just how we're made. So we evaluate. Is this thing meeting our need or not? Is this meeting what we want? Is this look or feel or sense, what we're wanting? And sometimes if that evaluating part of our brain, which is more left brain, but if it becomes critical, if it's blaming, if it blames the other person, and then that comes out, because sometimes we have a lot of pain, we have some painful feelings, and so it comes out. Sometimes we're going to insult the person. We're going to call them a poopy. Usually I joke about that. You poopy because you didn't do what I wanted. It didn't meet my need. Or you promised. Yeah. And there's times it doesn't mean that it makes the behavior the other person did or didn't do okay or not okay. But if you can just stay with that for a minute, because the insulting just is usually counterproductive, but can be very quick to come out, because that's kind of how those emotions, those very deep parts of those emotions can just come out. That's just how they function. The seeking, we just go do it. We don't always think about it. That's not an excuse. So then this part of our brain, and especially up in our prefrontal cortex, where we make decisions, if we can slow that down. Not always easy. Putting someone down, the insults, labeling somebody, you're being selfish, you're being self-centered, right? That might be some labels that come out. A lot of these words, I don't really want to go into those at this moment, but that can come up. It feels like the other person isn't carrying their weight. And sometimes they may not want to, or they can't. And that's a problem. That's why those discussions, and hopefully before we're even serious, so serious we're married or living together, when, it's really in that direction. But that's not always the case. It's kind of doesn't always happen. We don't even know to do that. Sometimes people diagnose the other person when our needs aren't being met. You're being not just selfish. It's like, those labels like narcissistic, which there are narcissistic behaviors, very self-centered kind of behaviors. However, yeah, like that's a matter of degree. These labels, these efforts tend to be counterproductive, right? It doesn't mean we can't think, gosh, maybe that's what's going on. But if I always am saying that you're this kind of person, that's, this label can really, probably not going to get more of my needs met. And you being angry is like, that could be driving it. That's really important to know. However, acting on it, that's where it gets really tricky. I've heard sometimes people, like, do you have autism, because they don't quite get it. And there are people, there are people with autism and high functioning autism. However, sometimes it's not always that may not always be the case. I go, gosh, not this huge group of people probably have autism. If it's that large, gosh, that is not all the guys that I work with. They don't always understand emotions, and there's some real, they don't know how to read the face or body language. They're not tuning into that. Some of that is culture and subculture influenced. Some of that could be some biology, but some of it's a skill that you can learn. And if it's important, like it's an important want for me, then for you as a person, then you can learn it. And that's kind of why I'm talking about that. If I compare you to other people, why can't you be more like so-and-so's husband or so-and-so's wife? When we were first married, you did this. Well, we're not the same exact people we were when we were married. Probably a lot of similarities, a lot of traits, are still there. But things happen. If we married really young and then, we get to 20, like 18, 19, 20, and then you get to be 25, your brain's actually matured, 23, 25, depending on the gender. It's 23 average for women, 25 average for guys. And then if guys have, or people have other kind of difficulties, people with ADD, it might be a little bit later. We're not totally, the same people. And then things change. But we can get our needs met. We can have some judgment if we don't always express it. And I mean, like non-verbally, because we can give that look, variety of looks, right? Rolling our eyes. And we'll probably have a whole meeting just about that, is that if we express that, that really is really hard for the other person if we're wanting to get our needs met. And I know sometimes it just comes out. And it's just kind of how we're made, because we need to evaluate, is this moving me closer to the things that I'm wanting and needing? And we, not in a selfish, like I have to accumulate everything. And for some people that may be the case, but for others, for the real connecting kind of people, that's not what I'm talking about. So if we go to punishment and reward, and that has a cultural piece to it. If you do this, then I'll do that. That has that contract, but it's like advanced, and it's beyond that. This can feel very manipulative. I'm going to withhold from you, or I'm not going to respect you. That kind of thing. I'll do this if you do that. Or I did this, so you should do that. Should, it would be another big area. You're wrong if you do this. You're right if you do that. Correcting other person. Yes, there's things that can give us life, that can meet needs. That's life-giving. And there are conflicts. Sometimes if I get what I want, you're not going to get as much of what you want. That kind of thing. So sometimes it's a little bit of a challenge for us. Correcting the other person, shaming the other person. I mean, it can get really much bigger than that. So demanding, and I probably will have, like I mentioned, a whole workshop or meeting about it. Demanding, you have to, you should, or it might be I should. I hear that a lot too. I must, I ought. There is a lot of these inside ourselves and towards other people. That's how they're supposed to act. That's what you're supposed to do. And sometimes I go, those are just cultural expectations. There are things that I'd like to have, right? And so then we'll talk, hopefully, and if you work with me, we certainly can bring that up. How can we be in the relationship when there's things that do meet our needs or don't meet our needs? But sometimes they just get to these levels that are just not very effective. So that's really the piece that we're talking about there. If I just criticize, well, you should be doing it this way, you should be doing it that way. And we hear a lot of that. And I go, that can feel very forced, which, if you're like some of us, and I can be like that, I just will back up. I will not want to do things unless it's really urgent, important, that kind of thing. That's different. But coming back to what is giving life to people. So we'll talk about some of our beliefs, deep-seated beliefs, and they can be very cultural, institutional kinds of things. So yeah, the demanding may get in the way. So I'll talk about the dynamic structure. How can we get more of what we want? And it just involves really knowing what there's something that happened, and that's really kind of vague, but then our feeling about it, and that's telling us, is that thing we're seeking, are we getting it? We'll talk about feelings, emotions, and sensations, and the actions, the behavioral kind, the action urges and actual actions that can go with them. So this has got some affective neuroscience, Jack Panksepp. I've been reading some of his. So so deep information, so many years of research. And I incorporate some of Marshall Linehan's ideas into this too, because there's different levels of our emotions and the corresponding sensations and actions where they're coming from. There's different parts of our brains up here. We can develop habits. And we want to ease into those as gently as possible, because if we go way outside of some of making changes, it can work on some things, but a lot of things we tend to push back and go back into those ways of thinking, of being, of feeling. So we'll look at frustration, anger, rage, which it's a tricky feeling. It's important though, it's very important. It's not one that we just want to throw out altogether, even though it's difficult. It's telling us something, but what can we do with it so it works for us? It's how we act, how we look. I mentioned that earlier. Gesture, posture. If we get aggressive, for example, that can be the problem if I'm angry. Anxiety, fear, hesitation, terror. We'll talk about those things. Play. Yes, that can be part of an actual emotional kind of very basic part of us where we want to have fun. And it does some things for us. It meets needs, the need for play, creativity. We don't always have that. Life could just be a lot of to-dos. Lust, the sexual aspects of relationship. Like how do we relate? And not necessarily, I don't think that one I haven't read quite as much about, but it relates to just sexual desire, some very basic desires, right? And we want to get those met. He uses lust, but you could just use the word sexual desire in there. Panic, grief, like when we're feeling very alone. We sometimes have panic because of a situation where there's, a threat out there, like fight or flight. But sometimes that's related to the feelings of aloneness, and sometimes it can be very panic. We can feel very panicked in a relationship when we're feeling alone, depending on the support. If we get support from that one person, it can be a little bit much if we don't have it, if there's a lot of conflicts and so on. Care, affection, nurturance, attention. We've kind of hit on that kind of drive, but it's very basic to who we are. So, and we'll go more in depth around our wants, our needs, and desires, those things we're seeking. So ways of being, doing, having. Some of the things that I've learned about through compassionate communication, some of Manfred Max Neef, I might bring in some of those because he has this very different way of looking. We tend, and he comes from an economical standpoint, but he's got some very practical, down-to-earth ways of meeting the needs in relationships, and broader than that, of course, too. So we'll try to do that. It's not about neediness, which we kind of learn in our culture. We shouldn't have needs. Sometimes people, and I find it with guys, I don't really need a lot. Well, we need certain things, and it's surprising. There's actually a lot of things we probably want to have, and we tend to downplay it because that's kind of expected. Not that we need to have lots of things. We may not be aware of all of them, but as we become aware, we might need them. It can be a source of judgment. You're being too needy. You got to stop that. Depends on how we approach it. And that's where that dynamic structure can help guide and make it less, because it's really our experience of the other person's actions or inaction. Wants, longings, desires. We'll talk more about that. And biggies, by the way, I was thinking maybe talking about what's love? What's that look like? Respect and trust. Those will come up a lot when I work with couples. I don't feel respected. I don't feel loved. I don't trust the other person. Like I've mentioned along the way, maybe some cultural influences, and I'm talking about some of these future classes. So what it means to be male and female, masculine and feminine, various cultures. The majority culture or other cultures can be very different. Worldviews, mindsets, spiritual perspectives. I like a pastor and teacher named Walter Wink. He's I don't know. People can have lots of impressions of pastors and teachers and religion. I don't think he is religious. He is kind of unique, but he saw things. I mean, gosh, he was an activist. He saw things from a very different point of view, where people, and here's the key thing: people are more important than things, than money. Those are ways to get some of the things we want and need. But is this, and Manfred Max Neef also talked about, is this economy serving the needs of the people, not of the government, not of institutions so much? And now those things, those groups, those organizations meeting the needs of employees and customers and people like that, right? There's some biological male-female differences. There's generalization, but there's some science there. I like Helen Fisher's work. She's got some really cool ideas that really show the value, some of the strengths. And there are some differences. She talks about temperament. And I like to incorporate some of those because we have different ways of kind of like being kind of predisposed. We don't always act in those ways, but we might be predisposed in certain directions, genetically, for example. Wellness, standard American diet. Gosh, that can make an impact. Not eating all day. We can come home and just be ravenous, and it's hard to meet the needs of other people, or of our partner, because that has taken over, for example. Or drinking so much coffee, we're all stressed out, and then we're trying to relate, makes it very hard. Fitness, I'm not going to teach fitness, but we'll probably hit on some of these things and what that means. And of course, with your doctor's guidance, and there are alternative people that I have talked to have just some ideas, because that can affect our mood. And you go, affects our mood, affects what we need, what we want. And it's sometimes so hard to get in, a good workout, or you're just so stressed to go do it. And then, it's not really life-giving. Even if our arteries might be better, our heart might be better off as our emotional heart. And we do have kind of a wisdom there. False moods versus other moods. Sometimes the way that our bodies are made, and I won't go too far because there's limits on my expertise there, but I know that sometimes if we're not eating some things, we don't have to totally change our diet. It's really hard. The standard American diet is just everywhere. So it's hard to change that. And if you wanted to, but there's ways to be different and feel different. Some moods may not be there once we even eat. I've had clients who have changed just some small things in the way they're eating, and will start to feel much better. Stop, doing some of the coping strategies. And women's needs are somewhat, I've talked about that are a little different than men's needs. But men have, and special needs that some of us may have. Like some of us may have proneness towards anxiety. Some of us may have proneness towards attention issues. Those are very different. Neurodiverse people, right? Neurodiversity. So it's just different, and the expectations could be the same, and some people function very differently. I'll just talk about ADHD. That attention tends to be different, and what a person may focus on could be different, and can create problems and stress in a couple. And if a partner doesn't understand that, can't give that kind of work with it, it can be very difficult. And there's some books and some nationally known psychiatrists who have that and talk about how relationships can be, might hit on some of those kinds of things. So I also want to hit topics like just some basics that help with all of this. Presence, awareness, mindfulness, like being present. Sometimes what does that mean, being present? It means I'm being fully here, by the way, and we'll kind of get into that, but that will show up in a relationship. I want you to hear me, but if I'm watching TV, I can get very distracted. So sometimes had to shut off that TV to really be able to listen. If there's lots of stuff happening on TV or something that's causing my attention to be split. So am I present in that moment? That's kind of why I started with just some breathing or focusing initially. Curiosity, what does that look like? Choices. Can I feel like I make choices? versus the have to, shoulds, and so on. Compassion, talk a little bit about compassion, empathy, validation. And validation, by the way, is not necessarily about approving of everything, but trying to understand. And so there's that under part, some assumptions that I bring into my work and what I would be talking about. Acceptance, how can I accept? Acceptance doesn't mean that I always approve, but do I accept it? Do I let that in, just letting things be? Understanding our feelings, of course, we'll talk about that. I think that will come up a lot. It was one of my favorite topics. And it can be hard because it's not as studied as some other topics. It's been kind of pushed aside until more recently. And then perceiving and evaluating. So those are kind of some of the directions I'd like to be moving in future lives or future workshops, classes, meetings here. So hopefully you had a wonderful time. And if we can just take a moment to just kind of sit back and go, so what can I take away from this? Like, what did I gather? Because hopefully I hit on a lot, and I did move through a lot. And then I kind of talked about where we're headed. But just take a breath now and go, oh, what was it? What could I take? And, some of those things could be as you take in that breath, or just focus on your finger, for example. You go, oh, I'm just going to be present here. What really stood out to me? Do I feel encouraged? Do I feel like I'm going to have some help seeking? I kind of feel like I'm moving in certain directions, and gosh, can I look at things a little differently? Can I change some of my beliefs or thinking about that? The things that drive the behavior once, like to figure out the hows, and then slowing down maybe on the how we do it. So that's a lot. And it was wonderful to have this, and I look forward to more. And if you need more specific help, you can reach out to me. So, so there we go. So thanks so much. Talk to you soon, I hope, or at least I'll see you on this side. You'll see